Welcome to Excel and Business Math video number 36. Hey, in this video, we got to complete a comprehensive Excel payroll example. Now, what this means is we are going to review videos 29 all the way to 35. This is video 36, and we have one new topic. But almost everything we're going to do in this video is a review. And why? Because on the up-and-coming test, you will see all of these topics. Now, we'll remind ourselves how to do time calculations from video 29. We'll remind ourselves how to use the if function when we have workers working overtime. We'll remind ourselves from video 31 how to use the mod function when someone's working a night shift. Video 32, we'll remind ourselves about the MROUND function to round to the nearest 5 minutes. We'll remind ourselves about video 34 when we use the median function to do FICA tax deductions. And we'll remind ourselves about video 35 when we used VLOOKUP a bunch of times for federal income tax withholdings. And then the one new thing we'll get to see is the SUMIFS functions. This function will make adding all of the employee hours much easier than the way we did it back in video number 30. All right, we're going to go over to the sheet March 5th to 9th, and this is our one example for this video. It'll be a big, long example, and there are no homework problems. Now, this is a payroll table with times for Monday, 11/26/2018 to Friday, 11/30/2018. And if we look at the date and employee column, there's 5 employees for each listed date. And then for each of those 5 employees, there's time in, time out before lunch, time in, time out after lunch. And then for the next day, it repeats the same 5 employees. So we're going to calculate in our first column hours worked. Now, we have to do 3 things in this column. We have to actually calculate from our times, which are decimals representing the proportion of a 24-hour day. So we actually have to calculate the proportion of a 24-hour day worked. We have to take into account that some employees are working the night shift, which means they're working past midnight. That's the second thing. And then the third thing is we're going to have to round each time to the nearest 5 minutes. Now, for our first calculation, time, we simply need to take time out minus time in and add the second time in minus time out. So to add those, I'm going to use the SUM function. In the number 1 argument, I take later time minus earlier time, comma. Second argument in SUM, we take later time minus earlier time. Now, those will yield decimals that represent the proportion of a 24-hour day, and the SUM function will add. Now, I'm going to Control-Enter, and when I enter that, the cell references in the formula will pull the number formatting. Now, in our final result, we don't want that, but for the time being, that'll actually help us, especially when we round. Now, I double-click and send it down, go to the last cell and hit F2. Cell references are looking good. But we clearly see that is the error that says we have a negative time. Whenever you have night shift, a formula like we did will not work. But luckily, as we learned in video 31, we can, for whatever our time calculation is, put it inside the mod function. Now, the mod function avoids a super long if function. We simply use that as the numerator and comma, we divide by 1. That will calculate the correct time worked no matter if it's a day shift or a night shift. Close parentheses, Control-Enter, double-click and send it down. Go to the last cell and hit F2. That's looking good. And sure enough, it totally fixed our night shift calculation. Now, we left the time number formatting because now we can see the first time is rounded to the nearest 5 minutes, but that's not. That should be 8:35. This one right here should be 9. So as we learned in video 32, F2, we can use not the round function, but the MROUND function. In the number argument is our time calculation, comma, and the multiple. That means what amount would you like to round to. By the way, multiple, that's why it's not round, but MROUND. We want to round to the nearest 5 minute, so we put 5 minutes in a cell and refer to it in our formula. F4 key to lock that. Now I can close parentheses, Control Enter, double click and send it down. Sure enough, that's rounded to the nearest 5 minutes, as is this one. Last cell, hit F2. I'm verifying all the cell references are correct. Now, we don't want the number formatting, so I'm going to come to the top cell and either use Home drop-down for General, or I'm going to use our keyboard Control-Shift-tilde, grave accent. Now, that's the proportion of a 24-hour day. And since Excel automatically takes times when they're enter and divides by 24, we have to bump it back up to hours, F2, by multiplying by 24. That number will never change, so we do not need to put it in a cell and refer to it with a cell reference. There it is, times 24, Control Enter. Look at that, it's still pulling the number formatting, Control-Shift-tilde or grave accent to apply the general number formatting. Now I double click and send it down, and now we have what we want. Each one of the total hours worked for each day for each employee. Escape. Now, notice we have Demetrius listed here, and then he is listed here again. And we need to add each one of Demetrius's hours. Now, what I'd like to do for total hours is I'd like to use Alt equals, that's the sum function, and then highlight the entire column. But somehow I want the sum function to pick out just the right numbers for Demetrius. Now notice the formula is going to be copied down, and the formula actually has the opportunity to look at the condition or criteria for adding Demetrius, Christina, Delphina, and so on. Well, we can't use the sum function because, of course, the sum function just adds everything it sees, every single number. But luckily, there's a function called SUMIFS. Now, SUMIFS means that it's going to try and sum from this column, but only if the number is for Demetrius. Now, there's 3 arguments in SUMIFS. And we actually, back in video 24, saw a similar function called COUNTIFS. But COUNTIFS is for counting. SUMIFS is for adding. And so we have to enter 1, 2, 3 different arguments. Now, sum range, that's all the possible numbers that you want to add. Now, I'm going to copy this formula down, so I need to hit the F4 key to lock that. Now I need to type a comma to get to the next argument. Criteria range, just like here it said sum range, those are all the numbers we potentially want to add from a range of cells. This says criteria range. That's the column with all the employee names. Now, because it's a whole column and it's coming from a range, I'm going to highlight the entire column. And notice the size of the employee names is exactly the same size as the numbers. That has to be true for SUMIFS to work. Now I need to lock that range, F4. But I'm missing one piece from this. SUMIFS properly has all the numbers and all the names. But what is it missing? It's missing the one single name that will tell SUMIFS to add just the numbers for Demetrius. So I come to the end, comma, and there it is. It says criteria. Now, it doesn't say criteria range because range reminds you that's the whole column with all the names. Criteria says just tell me which employee you want me to look for and add the hours. Now, that's a relative cell reference. So as we copy the formula down, it will move to the next employee, and so on. Close parentheses, Control Enter, double click and send it down. I'm going to go to the last cell and hit F2. Now, what did this do? That SUMIFS did not add all the numbers. Internally, SUMIFS looked at Vern Bunting, and it went through this column, looking at every single cell in this column. Is this equal to Vern? False. Equal to Vern? False. False, false. It found Vern, so then it knew to add the number from over in the sum range. It kept doing that, kept doing that. There's another Vern, so it knew to get that number. That's why SUMIFS needs the whole column with all the names, all the numbers to add, and then the one particular condition. Now, you could check, and I already did this one over here. Do not do this on the test because this is a completely not a good formula. But as you're learning a new function like this, go ahead and try and add all of Vern's. If you do it manually, it'll take a long time and it's prone to errors, but it at least tells us when we're using SUMIFS for the first time that we got the right amount. Now at the bottom, I have to verify, of course, that the sum range was locked. So as I copied down, it remained locked on all the numbers. Criteria range, same thing, locked on all the names, and that one's a relative cell reference. All right, so we have total hours. Now, if we scroll over, we don't need to use the timesheet anymore. We have a bunch of calculations to make to get our deductions and then our net pay. Now, this business says, like federal law says, that if you work over 40 hours, then we're going to pay the first 40 hours at your regular wage per hour. But we have to calculate overtime hours. We can do this one in our head. So Demetrius worked 1.5 extra hours. Now, when we get over to the overtime gross pay, Demetrius is happy because the overtime rate is 1.5. That means they're going to pay you $1.50 for every $1 of your wage. All right, so how do we have a formula calculate just the regular hours, not all the hours? Well, we use the if function, just as we saw in video 30. The logical test, I'm going to ask the question, hey, total hours as a relative cell reference, are you greater than the hurdle? Now I need to lock that, so I hit the F4 key, comma. If that logical test comes out true, which means the number is greater than 40, then what do I want for regular hours? Well, I want for value of true, the 40. F4 to lock it, comma. Otherwise, if you're not over 40, what do you want? Well, then you would just want the total hours. So I'm going to click on this. Now, notice the beauty of this is it comes out true for this cell for Demetrius. So value of true will be put into the cell. But when we copy the formula down to Christina, since that logical test comes out false, that's not bigger than 40, then the value of true will just be relative cell reference, the person's total hours. Close parentheses, Control Enter, double click and send it down. Go to the last cell and hit F2. All the cell references are working. And if I eye this, it's looking like it's working. 40, 40, 40, and these ones have the total hours. Now, overtime hours, that's an easy formula. I say, hey, the total minus whatever the regular hours are. Here, it'll give me 1.5. The next employee, it will give me 0. Control Enter, double click and send it down. Go to the last cell and hit F2. So we have our regular and overtime hours. Now, regular gross pay, I need to take regular hours times wage per hour. And we definitely have extraneous decimals. We're definitely dealing with money, and we're going to use this in a subsequent calculation. So we have to use the round function. Round, the number, relative cell reference for regular hours times wage per hour as a relative cell reference, comma. We round to the penny by putting a 2. Close parentheses, Control Enter, double click and send it down. Last cell is looking good. Now, overtime pay equals round. We're going to take number of hours for overtime times the full wage, but we need to bump it up $1.50 for every $1 in that wages per hour. So we use our rate of 1.5. That needs to be locked with the F4 key, comma 2, close parentheses. Control Enter, double click and send it down. Last cell is looking good. Now total gross pay, Alt equals, to get the sum function, it totally guesses wrong. So I'm going to carefully highlight regular gross pay and overtime gross pay. Control Enter, double click and send it down. Last cell, looking good. Now, this total gross pay we're going to have to use for Social Security, Medicare, and federal income tax deductions to get eventually our net pay. Now, I'm going to have to use some numbers from over here, cumulative, their marital status, dependents, and things like that. So I want to hide all of these columns so I can access all of these numbers I'm going to need for my formula and zoom the camera in. So I'm going to click on N and drag all the way to R. Now I'm going to right-click and hide. It only temporarily hides. Now it's much easier to see everything that I need. Now, cumulative gross after this paycheck. That's important for Social Security and Medicare when we deal with our hurdles. So I'm going to equals left arrow to get this paycheck plus the cumulative total that each employee has earned for gross pay up to the date before this paycheck. Control Enter and copy it down. Now, Social Security. Here's the hurdle. If your wages are equal to or below that, we take your whole pay and multiply it by 6.2. If you're above it, the tax rate is 0, or the tax itself is 0. Now, we talked about this back in video number 34. We have 3 situations. You're under the hurdle, you're jumping over the hurdle, or you're past the hurdle. If you're under the hurdle, the total amount to multiply by the tax rate is gross pay. If you're jumping over, it's just part of your gross pay. If you're already over before you started, then it's 0. And the way we deal with that, instead of using a big if, is to use the median function. And we put 1, 2, 3 different possibilities. Either it's 0, comma, either it's your total gross pay, comma, or it's the actual hurdle, and I'm going to have to use the F4 key, and we subtract not cumulative after the paycheck, but cumulative before. That will tell us the amount without having to use a big if. So I'm going to close parentheses, Control Enter, double click and send it down. Go to the last cell and F2 to check the cell references. So those are working. And we can tell right here, Demetrius was well above. Look at that. Christina started out at $130,005, but during this paycheck, she jumped over this hurdle. So not all of her earnings are taxed, just part of them. All of them, and the last employee was already well over the hurdle before they started. Now, come to the top, F2, we need to multiply that amount times the correct tax rate. And we have to F4 to lock it. All the conditions for rounding are met, so I need to use the round. Come to the end, comma 2, close parentheses. Control Enter, double click and send it down. Go to the last cell, hit F2, verifying that the cell references are working. So that's Social Security. Now, Medicare, they recently just changed this. It used to be we always just use 1.45. But now they have a higher tax rate when you jump over the hurdle. So we're going to have 2 separate columns. One column for whatever the deduction is below or equal to the hurdle, and another one for when we're completely over the hurdle. Now we use the same median function when we have a hurdle and 3 situations. And our 3 situations are either 0 earnings are taxed for the lower tax rate, comma, or your entire gross pay for this week, comma, or we take the hurdle, locked, F4 key, and we subtract whatever the cumulative was before this paycheck. And that will give me the amount to multiply times the first tax rate. Control Enter, double click and send it down. Go to the last cell and hit F2. We can clearly see that Demetrius started at $199,500. So Demetrius jumped over the hurdle. So only part of these earnings from this paycheck are taxed at the 1.45, and so the remaining amount will be taxed at 2.35. These employees are way under the limit, and the last employee already is way over. Now, before we multiply this times the tax rate and round, I'm going to come to the top cell, highlight that amount, Control-C, escape, and over here I want to do the formula for the amount when we get above the hurdle equals whatever the total gross pay is minus, and I'm going to Control-V. That's the amount that we use below the hurdle. So if we take total gross pay and subtract that amount, that'll tell us how much is taxed for the second tax rate. So the last employee, it better be all of it, and it is. And for Demetrius, it's just part of it. His total gross pay is split into two parts. Now we can multiply F2 times the correct rate, 1.45. F4, and I definitely need to round. All three conditions are met. Comma 2, close parentheses. So that will work. Control-Enter, double-click, and send it down. F2 over here, that is going to need to be multiplied, and I'm going to use parentheses because we have to force that subtraction first, times the second rate. That needs to be locked, F4. And we need to round. Round. I'm going to type the parentheses because there's two parentheses right there. Come to the end, comma 2, close parentheses. Control-Enter, double-click, and send it down. Go to the last cell and hit F2. Cell references are looking good. F2 on this one. Cell references are looking good. Now remember, as you're building this for the first time, you can check to see if your formulas are correct by either using the formula evaluator we saw, checking the cell references, and you can also make a calculation off to the side to just check, for example, is that 721 correct? Well, for Demetrius, we'd have to take whatever the hurdle is and subtract the begin cumulative. I have to put that in parentheses and multiply that times the tax rate. I better get $7.21, and I do. Now, those are two calculations, Social Security and our Medicare. Now we have to do our federal income tax withholding. And the first step is to calculate our taxable pay. Well, here's the total gross pay. Also over here, that's the number of dependents. Also, all of these employees are married, so we're using this one table here. Weekly married income tax table. Now, taxable pay. We have to take the gross pay and subtract the amount of allowance, that's the amount of tax that's not taxed, times the number of dependents for each employee. So for taxable pay equals whatever the gross pay is as a relative cell reference minus, and I'm going to take the amount of allowance for one allowance, F4 to lock it, and we're going to multiply it by the relative cell reference for dependents. That'll be our taxable pay. Control-Enter, double-click, and send it down. Now I'm going to scroll over because our calculation now becomes, if we do it manually, we take the taxable pay, we look through the first column, we find the correct category, so it's this third one here. Then we look in the last column, and the last column tells us what the rule is. We take cumulative tax from all the previous categories. That's column 5. We add to it, in parentheses, whatever the employee's taxable pay is. Then we subtract from the fourth column, upper limit from the previous category, close parentheses, and multiply times the tax rate. Now remember, what we're doing is we're looking something up, finding it in the first column, and jumping over. That's VLOOKUP. So what we really need in our formula is VLOOKUP 5 plus, in parentheses, taxable pay, minus VLOOKUP 4, close parentheses, and then times the tax rate. So we're going to do that equals VLOOKUP. The lookup value as a relative cell reference is taxable pay, comma, the table, all 5 columns, F4 to lock it, comma. The first column index is 5. That tells VLOOKUP to get the thing from the 5th column. I'm going to copy this because we're going to have to use that a few times. plus, in parentheses, taxable pay. And I need to subtract the number from the fourth column. So Control V, and then I change the 5 to 4. Now I have to close parentheses, making sure the black one is there and there. Now I multiply that whole amount times Control V. It is the third column which has the tax rate. And that will get our correct federal tax withholding before rounding. I'm going to double click and send it down, go to the last cell and hit F2, making sure that all of the cell references are correct. Now I'm going to come up to the top and I need to round just the multiplying part. So after the plus, round, open parentheses. Come to the end, comma 2, close parentheses. Even though that's a huge formula, I think that's about 8 or 9 different times between income tax, variable commission rates, and variable piecework rate that we've done this formula. Double click and send it down. Now we can add total deductions. And if I use the sum function, Alt equals, well, I set this up in a funky way. I definitely don't want cumulative. I definitely want Social Security. So I'm going to click to redirect it to Medicare. Then I'm going to comma, because I don't want taxable pay, and get federal income tax. Control Enter. Copy it down, go to the last cell and hit F2. Those cell references are looking good. Finally, we get to net pay equals whatever the total gross is over there minus total deductions. Control Enter, double click and send it down. F2. All right, so in this video, we had a complete review. We saw how to do net pay, total deductions, federal income tax with 3 VLOOKUPs in a round, taxable pay. Actually, guess what? We didn't have any employees were less, but we forgot. Remember, if an employee's total gross pay was less than the allowances, then our formulas don't work. So we have to put max around it. That means there's two numbers, either the max of our calculation, comma, or 0. Close parentheses. Control Enter, double click and send it down. Last cell looking good. We also did 2 Medicare calculations using median and round. Over here, there's the first Medicare calculation, making sure we have the right rate. Social Security, we used round and median. Cumulative, we simply added 2 numbers. Now I'm going to unhide, click between M and S, right-click, unhide. Total gross we added. Overtime gross, we made sure and used the 1.5. Regular gross, we used round. Overtime, simple subtraction. Regular hours, we had to use our if function. Total hours, we saw SUMIFS for the first time. And we started it all off over here. F2, with our calculation for time values, we used mod function because we had a night shift. MROUND to round to the nearest 5 minutes, and made sure to multiply by 24. All right, if you like that video, click that thumbs up, leave a comment, and sub, because there's lots more videos to come from excelisfun, including our next video, 37. That will be about invoicing. All right, we'll see you next video.